If you asked people if they believe that violence is the best way to achieve peace in their personal relationships, undoubtedly the most common response would be in the negative. After all, violence is the opposite of peace. But when you ask those same people if they think that war is necessary to achieve world peace, suddenly the answers become more pragmatic. Why the change? Can it be that a principle that applies to individuals ceases to become relevant on the scale of nations? Before we can answer that question, maybe the best way to proceed is to first define our endpoint, to demarcate what we mean by world peace, so that we know when we've achieved it. Is world peace when nations no longer war with one another? This is an appealing definition, and arguably the reason for the formation of the United Nations. I hope the solution leaves at the very least a niggling feeling at the back of your mind. It should feel a bit uncomfortable. What's wrong with defining world peace as a cessation of international war? Well, while it clearly defines the relationship that national governments have with one another, it says nothing about how those governments treat their citizens. Suppose all wars ended now. We'd still have the great concentration camp that is North Korea, starving and killing its citizens. What peace is there for the child watching her parents being publicly executed for a trivial misdemeanor? Could we not imagine a world where all national governments were tyrannical and fascist, but where there is no international warfare? A world of North Koreas and Nazi Germanys, all at peace with one another. Well, you might argue that such a world is impossible because fascist totalitarian regimes by their nature thirst for war. Only democracies shy away from international conflict. So by this logic, perhaps, you could claim that a world of no war would be the same as a world with benevolent or democratic regimes, because an end to all wars implies that every country is peacefully democratic. Not so fast, Dick Cheney. Wise diplomacy isn't the only way to achieve an end to warfare. Arm every regime with an arsenal of far-range, ballistic nuclear weapons, and you've got yourself a stalemate. In the Soviet era, this game theory equilibrium stalemate was coined mutually assured destruction, but it wasn't all that mad when you considered what it achieved. It pretty much guaranteed the USSR and USA would never openly attack each other. But wait, you say, surely an evil regime cares not if one of its cities is vaporized? A cynic of the mad approach to world peace might claim that the only concern for its citizens stopped the US and USSR governments from initiating nuclear winter, that the Cold War leaders were too moved by the plight of their citizens to engage in such acts of wanton mass murder. This may or may not be true. No one can know the personal motivations of those who controlled the nuclear codes, but nuclear weapons pose another threat, unique in history among weapons. They don't just kill citizens and soldiers. For the first time, a weapon exists that can vaporize the political elite and their families. For the first time, a weapon exists for which no place is safe. Even underground bunkers would struggle to repel the Tsar bomb. A world of totalitarian psychopathic monarchs still has very good incentive to maintain international peace in a world of nuclear weapons, if only out of self-interest. So the definition of world peace can't be restricted to just international relations, because it says nothing about the welfare of individual citizens in each country. The types of governments that exist matter. This might explain the neoconservative push to establish democracies globally following 9/11. Part of the Bush doctrine holds that democratic regimes are the most likely to establish good ties with other nations because they have established good ties with their own people. The problem with the push for democracy is that the interim establishment is not always so smooth as we've come to learn. Bad regimes don't tend to step down peacefully and yield to constitutional democracies. The end of apartheid and the ushering in of democracy in South Africa appears to be the exception, not the rule, in the quest for international democracy. The push for liberty through violent warfare is rather contrary to the spirit of liberty, and it's loaded with internal inconsistency. The very doctrine of warfare to establish peace is consequentialist. It's an end justifies the means, no matter how much suffering in the interim, the end result will be worth it approach. Whereas the end result, a republic founded on a constitution, is an attempt to establish a society where the means must be judged by their adherence to inviolable rules and principles such as respect for life, liberty, and property. How can you expect people who think that violence is a satisfactory approach to problem solving to be the ones who establish regimes founded on the very opposite principles? If American foreign policy was initially founded on the Jeffersonian dictum of commerce with all nations, alliance with none should be our motto, then the wars on terror are as un-American as they come. And if the war on terror is in opposition to American principles, then it takes some magical thinking to believe that the same people would help achieve the establishment of American-style republics. The stated goals of achieving democracy through war collapse under their own contradictions. So, let's summarize so far. Number 1. World peace isn't an end to international warfare, because totalitarian despots can achieve international peace through stagnation. Bad regimes can persist in the absence of war, so world peace has to focus on the lives of individuals. Number 2. World peace can't be achieved by toppling bad regimes, because the very act of doing so can be long and bloody and results in enormous suffering, suggesting the military doing the toppling is unlikely to hold the values that peaceful republics are founded on. And finally, putting diplomatic pressure and trade sanctions on bad regimes appeared to work on South Africa and the USSR, but few other places. And even in the success stories, it's far from conclusive that either Putin's Russia or the ANC's South Africa are flourishing republics where human rights are respected. Top-down attempts to establish world peace, whether through UN-style sanctions or Bush-Cheney-style crusades of righteousness, are both flawed logically and lacking empirically. For shorthand, I'll group these two top-down approaches under the umbrella term governed peace, because it's a type of world peace achieved through effective governance of people and nations. It's time we take the bottom-up, decentralized approach seriously. World peace is something that we have to achieve as individuals, one at a time. It's the only approach that's ever yielded meaningful results. We have to establish peace not just on a national or international level, but with each other. Peace isn't just about how the authorities treat us, but how we treat one another. I'll make the case that world peace requires us to adopt Gandhi's dictum, be the change you wish to see in the world. I'll call this type of peace interpersonal peace, because it starts by emphasizing how we treat each other. Most foreign policy realists will undoubtedly view interpersonal peace as a naive, misguided hippie love fest about brotherly harmony. They'll point to the fact that brutal regimes ignore peaceful protests and claim that such demonstrations are a luxury of living in a free country. That the rise of interpersonal peace is a sign of good government and not the other way around. They have some points. Protests are rarely tolerated in oppressive regimes, true, but no regime, no matter how absolute, can last in the absence of the consent of the governed. How can I claim this? What evidence do I have? Well, let's assume the opposite. Let's assume that it is possible for tyrants to govern despite the long-term consent of the governed. Well, if tyrants could rule over their populace without cause for concern or revolt, then why has every tyranny in history invested so much effort and resources into propaganda? Why waste time convincing the population that their total lack of freedom is for the greater good? Even North Korea monopolizes all forms of communication, ensuring the population is forever subservient to the dear leader. Propaganda, the religion of the state, is the smoking gun that shows that every government needs the continuing consent of the governed, even if that consent is brainwashed obedience. The claim by the realists that the right to protest is a luxury afforded by the benevolence of good government puts the cart before the horse. Sure, many protests are nothing more than a symphony of bongo drums and peculiar acrobatics, but the right to protest didn't pop into existence and wasn't handed down from a benevolent monarch. In the West, the right to free expression traces back to before the Roman Empire. The realist approach, that claims that good governments give us peaceful populations, runs contrary to the facts of history, and if past behavior is a good predictor of future behavior, then it is completely unrealistic. So why does interpersonal peace work? Number 1, it's the only peace that's ever worked. There is no example of a brutal regime transitioning to republican rule of law without pressure from its populace. When given the chance, no government happily relaxes laws, but throughout history the expansion of liberty has always been preceded by some crisis or rise of discontent. Consider the fight to end chattel slavery in the US. The Republican Party was formed primarily to challenge slavery and return the Union to its founding principles. While historians love to focus on broad narratives about wise leaders like Lincoln, it is sometimes overlooked that the Republican Party garnered such strong grassroots support precisely because the idea of human ownership offended the sensibilities of so many Americans. This repugnance wasn't new, but echoed the words and writings of many of the Founding Fathers 100 years prior, who conceded that the admittance of slavery into the Constitution was a pragmatic appeal to Southern state governments, not an espousal of personal values. Number 2. Interpersonal peace is intergenerational. Ever heard of the cycle of violence? Yep, well, that's a real thing. Violence begets violence. Psychological evidence is overwhelmingly clear about one thing. Hitting your child will increase their violent tendencies. You see, young children don't listen to their parents so much as they model their parents' behavior. A typically anxious parent who tells their children to be calm while exhibiting anxiety might as well be speaking to their children in Klingon. Children who are not hit growing up have a significantly reduced tendency to resort to violence when experiencing stress. Violent child-rearing doesn't end with physical abuse such as spanking. A child reared under a totalitarian parent will be far more comfortable as an adult living in a totalitarian regime. Put another way, how can you expect someone to resist a state that dictates every aspect of life if that's all they've ever known? How can you expect someone who was beaten with a belt buckle as a child and told by everyone around them that it's a fair and normal form of punishment to flinch in the face of police brutality? If we want to end violence in the world, we must not make it familiar to our children. We must not make control and oppression feel like home. Instead, we must make violence and control, corruption, abuse, lying, stealing, and war alien to children. We do this by keeping all those things out of the household, just as we make unhealthy eating habits alien by cooking healthy food. Steven Pinker is famous for documenting the decline in violence throughout the world over the past 1,000 years. Contrary to what the mainstream media tells us, wars are becoming fewer and less bloody, and interpersonal violence is on the decline throughout the world as well. For illustrative purposes, the levels of per-person violence in the townships of Johannesburg or the favelas in Brazil were quite common in most towns and cities in Middle Ages England. The murder rate in South Africa is among the highest in the world, around 50 per day. The rate per 100,000 is still marginally lower than the extrapolated murder rate of Britons during the reign of King Henry VIII. In the 18th century Paris, a few murders a day was the norm. Theft, robbery, mugging, murder, spouse, and child abuse as a proportion of the population has been on the decline in every country throughout the world for the past 8 centuries. Even the bloody 20th century, the century of total war and communism, is the most peaceful century to date if you take the number of deaths as a proportion of the population. So surprisingly, violence is on the down. William Lloyd Demouse, in his book The Origins of War and Child Abuse, has also found another interesting multi-generational trend. Parenting throughout the world has gradually been improving. Every generation of parents seems to care about their children just a little bit more than the generation before. Are these two trends, that violence is on the decline and that parenting is improving, just coincidence? Am I drawing a spurious correlation? We'll go back to what I said about the need to make violence and abuse foreign to a child. How many people do you know of personally who would relish in a good old witch burning? What about drawing and quartering, a blasphemer? The process of ripping a person into 4 parts by force and specially made incisions. No one? Okay. What about Guy Fawkes Day, the English celebration of resistance to parliamentary rule? Everybody likes that holiday. Remember, the 5th of November, where a bag of cats made to look like the Pope was set on fire so that the populace could laugh at the screaming head of the Catholic Church. What? Yep, that's how they used to celebrate it. Even animal circuses, a staple of 20th century entertainment, is waning in popularity amidst stories of rife animal abuse. Do you not think that the North Korean regime forces people to watch public executions for a reason? They have to make this sort of violence feel normal to people. A population for which violence is abhorrent will not stomach a violent regime, regardless of the propaganda. Furthermore, mounds of published evidence show that people who've grown up in the absence of violence are not trigger-happy by nature. Think about what this means for policing. A community of people who solve their problems amicably, not because they are forced to, but because it's all they really know, does not need a large peacekeeping police force in the area. On the contrary, they're likely to not tolerate one very well. At the time of the Civil War in the US, camera photography was beginning to find its use in journalism. When images of the horrendous brutality of the war began to find their way back to people living in otherwise peaceful homes, both the Northern and Southern armies found a new sense of pressure from their electorates to wrap it up. Relative to populations of serfs in the Dark Ages, forced into routine border skirmishes for their lords, or to Chinese villagers bracing themselves for regular Mongolian raids, relative to Japanese field laborers living under the arbitrary rule of the samurai, or Congolese farmers attempting to keep out of the path of mineral-hungry warlords, most Americans during the Civil War had grown used to peace and found no taste for violence when shown images of brutality. The goal of the peacekeeper should be to make violence repugnant and foreign. This process starts with how we treat our children and our neighbors. The cause for an ever more peaceful world appears to be a 2-step forward, 1-step backwards march. It's often unclear that the world is on a path to increasing peace when civilized countries are still bombing and mutilating people in uncivilized countries. It's hard to make the case that the world is civil when most countries are willing to incarcerate and kill people who carry around the wrong type of plant. Alcohol prohibition in the US seemed to give way to violent drug prohibition. Slavery gave way to the Jim Crow laws. Apartheid gave way to runaway corruption. Soviet Russia was replaced by the Tsar of Putin. The US military grows ever bigger. The Chinese military grows ever bolder. If violence is on the decline, why does the world not feel like it's getting better? Well, I believe it's a matter of time frames. If we look at the world year to year, or even decade to decade, it appears to be spinning under the weight of the same humanitarian problems. But zoom out, and things look a little different. Take the US. It has been estimated that on average every US citizen breaks 3 laws a day without knowing. The scale and scope of government has grown stupendously since its founding. It seems that every day another victimless crime is made illegal. But, with all that said, no one seriously fears a return to chattel slavery. Even the war on drugs has finally become unpopular with a majority of the population. The evils of marijuana dogma appears to not be impressing modern Americans as much as it did their parents and grandparents. It's highly unlikely that a law criminalizing homosexuality will ever again be considered on any legislative level. The Patriot Act, a necessity in defeating the terrorists, is increasingly being viewed as a thinly veiled attack on the Fourth Amendment. While fear-mongering and propaganda is as effective as ever in maintaining the status quo, there are certain thresholds that governments, no matter their motives, can't push their populations over. The euphemism for this is political expediency. The trend of improved parenting seems to be as strong as ever, as shown by the popularity of shows like Oprah, Dr. Phil, and the massive success of self-help books focused on improved child-parent relationships. The modern generation is less inclined to be scared into giving up their hard-won liberties. They are more empathic, and empathy is the enemy of xenophobia, racism, animal abuse, and victimless crime. The cycle of violence has a twin counterforce, the cycle of peace. The two forces are at war with one another. The cycle of violence finds its nourishment in top-down rule, in societally condoned violence, in propaganda that seeks to divide and conquer. The cycle of peace is fragile and begins in the home. The medical profession often emphasizes the need to inoculate young children to prepare their bodies against diseases and viruses later in life. But the most important vaccine for any child is the vaccine against violence. We need to give our families and friends the antibodies to resist the virus of human violence, and to do that, we need only give them peace.